During my time making SRB2 mod reviews, I have played as a lot of characters. Many were fun, many were not, but as I moved from one character to another, I began to notice some patterns. If a character had one notable stat, it would likely be balanced out with a below average one, and certain stats had these clear antagonistic relationships across dozens of characters. If a moveset was designed to excel in a specific field, then its deficiencies would be shared with most of its similar peers. If a character had an ability that had already been used elsewhere, then you could bet solid money on that character using a specific suite of other abilities. In other words, it became clear that mod developers were designing their characters to fulfill certain niches, and as more and more characters were designed to fulfill a specific niche, there became a certain list of traits associated with that niche. Groups began to be formed. There was delineation into semi-distinct categories. You might go so far as to say that the SRB2 community had developed a system of character archetypes. An archetype is a concept common in literature analysis and psychology, and is, in essence, a way to taxonomize broader groups of ideas into smaller categories based on common criteria. You may well have heard of the hero's journey or the monomyth, a framework devised by Joseph Campbell that condenses hundreds of myths from across the world into their common elements. As such, the hero's journey can be considered just one of many archetypes seen across literature. If you're more keenly aware of Tekken than of Troy, however, you may have heard of the archetype in a different context: fighting games. Sotos, grapplers, zoners, and puppets are all fighting game archetypes, and act as a shorthand when explaining to a noob how a character plays. Ryu and Ken are Sotos because they have a Hadouken, Shoryuken, and well-rounded stats. Zangief and Potemkin are grapplers because they are slow, bulky, and focus on throws. Axel Low and Eustace are zoners because of their strong, long-range game, at the cost of poor performance once the enemy finds an opening. If you're a Mortal Kombat player and a Street Fighter comes up to you and asks for a character that plays like Cammy, then you know to recommend someone like Baraka, as they're both members of the Rust-Down archetype. The most I've played of a fighting game is an hour's worth of World Tour on Street Fighter 6, so if you're a member of the FGC, raising your pitchforks after I completely mischaracterized your main, I apologised and please don't hurt me. This same principle can also be applied to SRB2. I've spent the last few weeks categorizing dozens of characters into one of 7 archetypes, based on common elements in their game plans, movesets, and stat spreads. This is not a comprehensive list, and I will not be listing off every character I've ever played that I feel fits into a given archetype, instead only listing some of the most exemplary and representative members of the group. I will be using these archetypes in the future though, so don't be surprised when I begin using them as if they are official terms. And as a final disclaimer, by nature of the game, it is inevitable that characters will exist that straddle the line of 2 archetypes, especially some of my more specific ones. They're not meant to be completely distinct, and that's fine. You'll lose a lot of nuance and subjectivity if you try too hard to fit concepts into rigid definitions. With that said, I'll start the list with the archetype I think everyone can agree best epitomizes the highlight of playing a Sonic game. To absolutely no one's surprise, one of the most popular archetypes in a Sonic game is that of the speedster. Seeing as the titular protagonist of Sonic Robo Blast 2 is the quintessential member of this group, I'd also imagine that this is the archetype that everyone is going to be most familiar with, unless you're the kind of person who actually follows Sonic Team Junior's advice and played as Tails for your first playthrough. Weirdo. The primary thing that binds all speedsters together is a need for speed, and whether it be via an outrageously high top speed, lightning fast acceleration, a powerful ability, or a combination of all three, Their game plans are designed to sate that need and then some. In a world where almost everyone can be considered fast, they rank as some of the fastest in the pack, and if you're interested in speedrunning, there's no better place to start. Be warned though, this speed usually comes at a heavy cost. Compared to most other characters, a speedster is usually fairly simplistic, and their high performance can usually be best attributed to raw stats and player skill. Their movesets are often quite lacking, especially when it comes to vertical movement, leaving all but the most skilled of the group stuck on the intended path through a level and vulnerable to hazards. You're unlikely to be able to take shortcuts or avoid platforming challenges unless you really nail down an individual speedster's moveset, and so while you might be by far the fastest in a drag race, and even in more complex courses so long as you practice and polish your routes, there is the occasional sectional level where you'll really come to bemoan their lack of flexibility. In many ways, a speedster is to SRB2 what a Soto is to Street Fighter, the fundamentalist archetype that will force a new player to interact with everything the game wants you to know, and which acts as a good baseline to compare how other archetypes strengthen, weaken, and exaggerate different traits. The archetype is represented by the face of their respective franchises, Sonic and Ryu. They both have an unlockable boss that ramps their traits up to 11, Metal Sonic and Akuma, and it's a favourite genre of character for all who follow in their footsteps. Every fighting game needs at least one Soto, and who knows how many speedsters have been posted to the SRB2 message boards. If you want to go fast and believe everything else is superfluous to the Sonic experience, then you can't go wrong with the speedster. The flyer is effectively the inversion of the speedster. Where the speedster lacks vertical mobility, the flyer has it in spades. Where the speedster has a ton of options for gaining speed, the flyer is comparatively limited. Where the speedster is honestly quite a difficult archetype to play as, yet is almost always the first experience a new player will have with SRB2, the flyer makes the game a breeze, yet is relegated to a second or third playthrough. It might seem strange to justify creating an archetype for a singular ability, and indeed it would be with any other, but Fly is so often used without significant changes, so often used by characters with the same list of pros and cons, that such a category can genuinely encompass a significant portion of the totality of characters in SRB2. Of course, Flight is an extremely powerful ability to have in a platformer, and any character who has it immediately gains a significant advantage over everyone else. They can use it to avoid difficult platform sections and to easily swap between different paths through the level. In some rarer cases, it can even be used to save yourself if a mistake is made and death would otherwise be inevitable. As such, the flyer is a fantastic choice for new players, who can use their powerful central ability and generous mobility to offset the usual beginner mistakes. Their problem is that these are not traits that are particularly appealing to more experienced players, at least not when they're packaged with the flyer's main flaw. As a rule, flyers are some of the slowest characters in the game, because Flight usually has a very low movement speed, and is almost always the only noteworthy ability a flyer has. If a character can fly, then it's a fair bet that they probably don't have any other major abilities, and so have no way to significantly increase their top speed outside of difficult speedrunning techniques. Additionally, for as powerful as Flight is, it can't be used to enter many of the additional routes and shortcuts throughout the game, which further limits the flyer's potential. SRB2 is still a Sonic game, and so flyers are still fast, but if you were to grade the average performance of the average member of each archetype, then the flyers are likely to be at or near the bottom of the list. Unlike the speedsters, there is only one flyer in the vanilla roster, that of course being Tails. There are dozens of flyers to be found on the message boards though, most of whom will have a slightly different spin onto how their flight works. There are plenty of alternate versions of Tails, a couple of characters who use similar stamina mechanics to Vanilla Fly, but expand their wider moveset, and then several characters who have some variation of infinite flight, like Egg Robo or Terabyte. If you're a beginner looking for a forgiving first time with SRB2, then pick a flyer. If you're more of a veteran though, then I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that there are more engaging archetypes to be found. An explorer may initially seem like they share a lot of traits with a flyer, as both have far superior vertical movement to a speedster, but they diverge due to the explorer's ability to get to places a flyer never could. Walls, floors, and spikes block off plenty of alternate pathways throughout SRB2, and it is only by playing as an explorer that you will be able to access some, or all, of these unique ways through a level. Like the speedster, the explorer is characterized less by one specific ability, and more by a general game plan, finding collectibles and taking on an unconventional route to the goal. This is a vague mission, and so there is a great deal of variety in how different explorers will achieve it, but there is a general agility to ensure that they can make it where they need to go to do this. Sometimes that's by high jumps and sometimes by climbing, but whatever weird or fantastical way it's done, most explorers boast excellent mobility, almost always vertically and often horizontally as well. Of course, once they reach whatever floor or wall is blocking their unique path, they'll need to be able to destroy it, and there can be a great deal of variety here too. Sometimes they're bulky enough to break the offending geometry simply by walking into it, but ground pounds and punches are common abilities for doing that as well. Befitting an archetype with such a variety in their strengths and movesets, it's difficult to find any common weaknesses across all explorers. No one list would be suffice to cover the entire category, but I suppose that you can make the argument that it's common for explorers to have mediocre stats. Their movesets are often large and flexible enough that the only way to balance them is to make their entire stat spread lacking. I'd say most explorers are pretty slow for their power level, and low jump height can be a common way to force a player to interact with the wider move pool at their fingertips. That larger moveset can also be a problem for newer players, because it's easy for them to get overly complex or overwhelming. No archetype has a monopoly on big move lists and high skill floors, but I'd hazard a guess that the explorers are where these become most common. Explorers represent the final corner of SRB2's trifecta of design principles. Speedsters represent the ever-present sense of speed necessary for a Sonic game, flyers represent platforming in the abstract, and explorers urge the player to use the tools on hand to seek out secrets and rewards. It therefore makes sense for Knuckles, as the final member of Team Sonic, to be the purest expression of the explorer, slotting right alongside Sonic and Tails as avatars of their respective archetypes. I think Amy could also be argued to be something of an explorer, although she's certainly more of a hybrid with some speedster DNA thrown in there. If you want to spend your time looking for emblems and finding pathways you've never seen before, then an explorer is your best bet. With a lack of meaningful consideration on how to produce an engaging combat system, SRB2 is unable to offer boss fights worthy of much thought. Despite that, there are a small handful of characters who, intentionally or not, are used primarily for fighting bosses, with powerful ranged attacks and defensive options, giving them the rare gift to make fighting a boss that much more interesting, or at least making the encounter end mercifully quickly. The combatant is difficult to discuss because it is a rare archetype. More so than any other, being a member of this archetype is actually usually unintentional. There just aren't enough fights in SRB2 to make it worthwhile investing purely into performance in them. Despite that, there are still a few commonalities across most combatants, usually in regards to their moveset. Stats matter less than for most other archetypes, although above average agility and mobility are recurrent. Range is a common speciality, making projectiles and long-range homing attacks not uncommon, but even once the gap between an enemy has been closed, intentionally or not, they usually still have a trick or two up their sleeve. Parries are a mechanic I have seen grow in popularity over time, and other defensive options have been in use even longer. Shorter range attacks are often devastating, either due to large areas of effects or even dealing more damage than usual, ensuring that combat efficacy is maintained from any distance. It's outside of combat that the combatant stumbles. Almost as a rule, there is little joy to be found in playing as one in a standard platforming stage. There's always just something, whether it's a matter of missed potential or a central ability that just doesn't quite work, which ends up dooming the archetype to seeing little use outside of the arena. I'll use Fang as an example. It seems to be a general belief that his tail bounce isn't fun to use, meaning that only the combat-oriented side of his moveset sees any use. Speed is a common deficit, a lethal flaw for a character in a Sonic game, and their martial abilities can be difficult to use for movement, limiting movesets and breaking flow. No one specific flaw or defect characterizes the combatant, unlike most other archetypes, but there is always something that makes them a difficult pick. I've already name-dropped Fang as a combatant, but there are a small number of modded characters I remember finding the most use of as boss slayers. Very few of them are what I would consider to be a pure combatant, however. This is likely for the best, as out of all of the archetypes I'll be discussing today, this is the one that feels the least worthwhile. Most mod creators want their characters to be used often by players, so making them underpowered in a plurality of situations to focus on a smaller, unappreciated element of the game would be a silly move. With that said, all vanilla characters have now been classified within at least one archetype, meaning that all upcoming archetypes are in recognition of patterns found within the modding community. Although there are a few examples of hybrid characters in the vanilla cast, I think it's fair to say that each of them was given a focus area in which they would excel. It's an important part of developing an interesting moveset, but it is all too common for this to be ignored in the modded world. The result? Characters who are equally competent at all aspects of the game, which usually lead to flat and uninteresting movesets. All-rounders are just as fast as they are agile, as vertically obliged as they are horizontally proficient, as dangerous to a boss's health bar as they are to a level's time limit. This usually makes them pretty strong, and as many of them are simple enough to get to grips with, they can be very popular. Many of the most downloaded mods on the SRB2 message boards are all-rounder characters. If handled well and with considered intent, they can be fantastic. I'm not the sort of contrarian who would argue that Sado is actually hugely overrated. However, if created by smaller, less experienced teams with little planning time or playtesting, these Renaissance Mobians can easily become quite wooden. Let's say a character comes across a platforming challenge. Each of the archetypes of the base trifecta will guide the player, based on the archetype's innate strengths and weaknesses, to approach that challenge in a unique manner. The speedster will take the platforming head-on, the flyer can fly over it, the explorer can take an alternate path. This creates dynamism and forces the development of a mental game plan that directs how the player should act, a clear sign of player engagement. But if an all-rounder were to come in and be able to take any of these routes to completion, then that dynamism is lost alongside that engagement. The problem is often exacerbated by poor balancing, because with the loss of innate archetypal weaknesses, this needs to be actively considered for the first time by the developer. Some all-rounders will have been designed without considering this, making them too good at everything and causing their movesets to feel flat. Others will have considered it and then take it too far, creating characters that are weak across the board and therefore a massive slog to play. Balancing a speedster is easy. If you increase their speed, you reduce their verticality. Inverse it to balance a flyer. But if you were to do the same to an allrounder, they would cease to be an allrounder and instead become another archetype entirely. I've already mentioned Sado as an example of an allrounder done right. His Chaos Snap offers excellent vertical and horizontal movement, and it pairs with his homing attack to give him the advantage in combat. That's then balanced by weak stats and a lack of a secondary ability, which keeps him engaging, an accolade I'd also give to other popular allrounders like Werehog and Mamie. There are tons of allrounders who fail this delicate balancing act though, and they make up a huge amount of the unremarkable mass of unloved mods. It's not my place to name and shame today, but rebalancing into different archetypes would help a majority of these stand out far more. At this point, everyone knows how incredibly flexible SRB2 can be. This game has been made into a racing game, made into a racing game sequel, backported to a 30-year-old console, made into an RPG, made into another RPG of a completely different style, made into Pilot Wings, made into WarioWare, ran entirely on a website for an April Fool's joke, and it can even play Doom in what is frankly a disgustingly perverse show of incestual code, running itself into an Ouroboros loop. It is therefore no surprise that many have endeavoured to replicate the gameplay loops of various other genres in the vanilla experience. Enough have, in fact, to warrant the creation of an entire archetype. Mavericks are characterised not by the sharing of common gameplay traits, but rather their complete rejection of any sense of commonality. It is of course impossible to find honest consistencies between three characters when one replicates a first-person shooter, one replicates a party game, and the other replicates a different 3D platformer. What I can say is that Mavericks are universally extremely high effort and regarded appropriately, because it is an order of magnitudes more difficult to create a character with wholly unique physics and interactions with gameplay systems than it is to play around with editing a few statistical values and making some custom abilities. This is required for any Maverick. Undertaking the development of one is recognition of the time and energy it will take to create it, and half-arsing it will only result in the character being relegated to an archetype that still fits within the bounds of the standard gameplay loop, like a speedster or an explorer. First-person shooters and 3D platformers are the genres most commonly represented by Mavericks, likely a reflection of SRB2's history and the tastes of the average developer team. The FPS is almost certainly overrepresented due to SRB2 infamously being built off the Doom engine, likely meaning there is leftover code that can be used as a basis for an FPS experience. There are Mavericks replicating the gameplay experiences of Doom, Wolfenstein, Half-Life and Metroid Prime, and even more based on various third-person shooters. It's also easy to see why 3D platformers are common targets for replication, although this is the one genre where a character could conceivably be a hybrid with some other archetype. Mario is constantly getting new mods replicating the sensibilities of one game or another, to the point that I lose track of which Mario mods I have and haven't covered yet, and there are also lots of Sonic mods that use custom physics to more closely emulate different franchise highlights. I love a good Maverick, even if it is the archetype I have the most trouble setting up on my controller. There's always some ability that is either constantly triggered or rendered entirely inert by my unconventional control scheme. As such, you can consider all of the names I'm about to list off as highly recommended. Metroid Vanguard, Adventure Sonic, E102 Gamma, BJ Blazkowicz, Takis, and X-Sonic. Some of those are admittedly something of a hybrid, but all are major gameplay departures you want to be sure to check out. Everyone loves a meme, but a good one is often an ephemeral thing. They pass just as quickly as they appeared. However, It seems that the memo was never passed on to the SRB2 modding scene, because there are tons of mods adapting memes both past and present. Sometimes the humour lands and the mod's a success, but there's just as much of a chance the mod launches far too late and flops out of the gate. Meme characters are in a similar situation to joke characters in fighting games, as an unnecessary but fun addition to a character roster. They also share the same design problems, in that there's only really two ways to make a joke character funny. You either make them outrageously overpowered, or laughably abysmal. Most meme characters lean more towards the former category, acting as all-rounders on crack. They tend to have immense mobility and agility, with very high stats and potent movesets, which are then granted to a character who is already extremely fast. Funnily enough, if you want to put in minimal effort for maximum results in speedruns, a good meme character is often your best pick over a more serious and well-considered speedster or all-rounder, because who is actually going to put in the time and effort to balance what is effectively an extended joke? With that said, you do occasionally come across a meme character that ends up further to the other side of that aforementioned spectrum, and this is where it becomes really important that the humour lands to offset the tedium of actually playing the game as someone who is a mechanical drag. Perhaps unsurprisingly, meme characters are the archetype that has the highest proportion of slop, as characters are spewed out in a matter of days to capitalise on a fading meme before it dies out completely. With no time to expend on the important steps of testing and conceptualising a unique moveset, many will end up falling back on safe and reliable choices, and the most variation you can hope to find are a few edited values. That's where you tend to get super powerful memes from, as a developer with no time to waste just dials everything to 100. But it's also why meme characters often have basic, disjointed, stale movesets that limit the quality of the flow state you can achieve. Whether you decide the joke will be the character being over or underpowered, it's more worthwhile utilising development resources on the visual and auditory aspects of the character, which are the biggest vectors for comedy on a character who isn't supposed to be taken seriously. For the most part, memes are the junk food of the SRB2 world, and you can find dozens of characters fitting into this archetype who were clearly conceptualised, designed, produced, and released within a week. There are a few memes that did see genuine development effort, but it's unfortunately quite rare. Takis is the best example I've played, but I can't say the Crows, Doomslayer, or Sonk were anywhere near high quality releases. Those were the 7 archetypes of SRB2 character that I have so far been able to identify. There were the core trifecta of a speedster, flyer, and explorer, who each represented a core aspect of SRB2's gameplay loop, the combatant and the all-rounder, who fill important niches but are somehow still found lacking, and finally, the Mavericks and memes, who are categorized by their refusal to follow SRB2's rulebook. I am sure that some of you will peer over that list and argue it's a bit short. Seeing as I have based these archetypes on those found in fighting games, where there can be argued to be dozens of such things, you would be right to argue that. However, I kept this list as short as it is in an attempt to keep it pure. As I wrote this script, I conceptualized loads of more specific archetypes, but as I moved to assign characters to them, I realized that I couldn't find any that belonged exclusively to each archetype. That was ultimately what narrowed down this list to just 7. I would argue that each of these archetypes contain multiple characters who can only be characterized solely as a speedster, or as an all-rounder, or as an explorer, and so on. There are overlaps, of course, but if you were to cut them out, you could still find a healthy character roster organized into 7 distinct groups. Perhaps I'll return to this concept if this video does well or the situation calls for it, and amends the list with a number of more granular categories, ones that currently fit partially or entirely into one of the 7 existing domains. But I think that, for now, this is a solid foundation. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. As I mentioned at the start, I'm going to begin using these terms more consistently in future uploads, as if they were official. So getting this far ensures that you'll know what I'm talking about going into the future. For now though, I hope you enjoyed the video, and ciao.